That's the situation that Muhammad Ali found in Egypt. Complete chaos. The Ottomans are not in control. The army is very weak. And through his cunningness, he saw an opportunity. This is a very wealthy country. It's very badly managed. And I effectively have the only effective fighting force, until eventually the Ottoman Sultan says, okay, well, I have no alternative except to acknowledge you. And he gives him this very, very privileged and prestigious position as governor of Egypt.
Welcome to the Afikra podcast. My name is Mikey. Today on the series, we have Professor Khaled Fahmy, who is the Edward Keller Professor of North Africa and the Middle East at Tufts University. Welcome, Khaled. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Mikey. It's a pleasure and an honor to be with you. Look forward to the discussion, conversation, and let's take it.
I'm so happy that you're here. I reached out to you specifically because I told you that I've always been fascinated by Mehmed Ali Pasha. And I was looking him up online, and you quite literally have written not the book, but many books about who this guy was. And I thought I need to talk to you about this character who is such a central figure in the history of the region. So I'm very, very excited to do that. But before we jump into his history, I'd like to know a little bit about your history. When did you first decide that you wanted to study history, and specifically you wanted to study the history of this guy?
Well, I actually didn't decide. I think it happened by accident. I studied economics as an undergraduate student at AUC, and then I did a master's in political science. And while studying economics, I enjoyed it, not that much. I enjoyed economic history classes, and I enjoyed political economy classes. And then when I did my master's, it was, the thesis was on Egyptian economic policy in the 1970s. In the master's, I was doing it in the 1980s. So it wasn't really ancient history, but it was like looking at the past again, so it's economic history. And then I thought, I'd like to pursue this further, studying Egypt, finding out why we are in the mess we're in. And I applied to study, for a PhD in what I thought would be economics, so I applied to economics departments, to do economic history, thinking that economic history, like AUC, is part of the economics department, not the history department. So I was, kind of surprised to find myself. I was very, of course, happy to find myself accepted at Oxford University, but then I found myself accepted in the Department of History. And so it was a bit awkward, and I actually couldn't tell my parents that I was accepted in the history department. But
they've already bragged to all their friends that their son is studying economics at Oxford. I mean, how could they?
I think we bragged about the fact that their son was studying at Oxford, period. And I think that trumped everything else. So, like a year into my degree, I kind of came out to my parents and told them, I'm actually a historian. So, and then the big challenge was when I discovered, so what does actually being a historian means? And the baptism by fire kind of came when I was sent to the archives, my second year to do my field work, so to speak. So I was sent to Egypt to do research in the Egyptian archives. And that's when I panicked. I didn't know what archives are. I didn't know what I'm supposed to be doing. And that's when I was actually trained to be a historian. I mean, I always read history. But to actually then go and look for material. And that is basically how I ended up being a historian. So it wasn't really a deliberate decision.
How funny. Well, it's a lucky coincidence. I want to talk about this character. Okay. And I'm going to ask a really, really, really simple question. Was Muhammad Ali Egyptian?
That's not a simple question. That's a very loaded question. So first of all, we're not talking about the boxer. We're talking about someone who's usually dubbed as the founder of modern Egypt. So he was not Egyptian in the sense that, I mean, he's definitely not Egyptian. He was not born in Egypt. He didn't speak Arabic. He really had no connection to Egypt. He comes from a town called Kavala, which now is in Greece, northeastern Greece, which back then, he was born in 1770. And back then, Kavala was part of the Ottoman Empire. When Napoleon invaded Egypt in 1798, the Ottoman Sultan didn't really have a powerful standing army to defend one of his most precious provinces from this French invasion. So he sent orders for the regular army to descend via Syria to Egypt to expel the French out of it. But he also gathered or sent orders for a new army to be raised from what we now call the Balkans, including Kavala. So this guy, Muhammad Ali, but we can actually use the Turkish pronunciation of his name because he was a Turkish speaker. Again, Kavala is part of the Ottoman Empire. He's a Muslim Turk living in this very important part of the empire, the Balkans, but in a very provincial town in it, So Mehmed Ali joined a contingent from Kavala that was part of a larger group of Albanians. And they ended up in Egypt in 1801, I think in March 1801. So that's when people get confused because, definitely he's not Egyptian. Ethnically, what was he? Was he an Albanian or a Turk? Yeah. And I claim that he was not Albanian. He was a Turk. His parents are both Turks. His father hails from central Anatolia. His mother hails from a town north of Kavala in what is now Greece. But because he came to Egypt as part of this larger Albanian contingent, his name became associated with the Albanians and he joined them. He became known in Egypt as part of this Albanian group. So he ended up in Egypt in 1801 and he basically ruled the country through a very complex set of circumstances until 1848. So he basically made Egypt his second home, eventually becoming his first home. And he became so deeply associated with Egypt, and so much so that, as I said, he's dubbed as the founder of modern Egypt.
So I want to talk a little bit about his first 30 years for a second. What was he doing? Why was he even tapped as this figure? Was he some great military leader or some great administrator back in Kavala? Did he come from some aristocratic family? What qualified him to be this person that is brought in to save the day?
He was really a nobody. This is why this is a very dramatic and remarkable trajectory. He's born. His parents are not particularly wealthy. I think his maternal uncle was the governor of Kavala, however, so he's not completely destitute. They're not poor. They're not big merchants or, his father might have been a watchman, basically a guard. So, and he didn't go to school. So that's again another sign of the privileged background. But the fact that his maternal uncle was the governor of Kavala meant something. And most likely the house that is typically highlighted as his house in Kavala, and we have pictures of it, continues to exist today. That's most likely not the house in which he was born. That is most likely the house of his maternal uncle. in any case, he didn't go to school, and he's a troublemaker. He's an intelligent, ambitious young man, but not with any known profession or particular skill, except the skill of, well, put it politely, would be to command people. Put it not so politely, would be to be a bully. I think he was a bully, if not a thug. He was the village thug. And he had a group of followers, and sometimes he took the law in their hands. Sometimes on behalf of his maternal uncle, sometimes not on behalf of his maternal uncle. And I think eventually he became a troublemaker. He dabbled in some trades, maybe on behalf of his father. We don't really know, but nothing consistent. I think the main consistent thing is that he didn't really have a proper job. So eventually his uncle and his parents wanted to settle him down. So basically to marry him off. They suggested a woman from Nusratli, which is the town from which his mother hailed. And this woman had actually been a widow in the sense that she'd just been married to a wealthy man, although the marriage was not consummated. And so the uncle proposed this marriage, and he said he couldn't believe his luck. Why would this woman, who now is a wealthy woman, agree to marry him? But somehow she did, and he married this woman, Amina, and he kind of settled down, and maybe he invested in her money and basically her inheritance in some kind of trade, and together they had 5 children. And not in Nusratli, in Kavala, but still, he continued to be the troublemaker. And I think eventually his uncle thought, well, now there is this new court for arms, and maybe I can send
him to the army.
Send him to the army. Of course, it wasn't a regular army. This is not conscription. This is like gathering people, like in pre-modern armies, campaign by campaign. So he sent him off to Egypt in the hope of getting rid of him. Maybe he will finish and do some business in Egypt.
So he has 5 children at the time. His uncle says, "Get out of here. You're a troublemaker. You're a mess."
Yes,
basically.
But not completely an exile, but I think again, and he didn't know what to do with him. And I think he thought he'd go to Egypt, and maybe if he's like some luck, he'd come back with some money, as people do on campaigns. And especially given his talents, as again, he's a good reader of character. Again, to put it positively, he's a bully, and
he sounds like a Trumpian figure.
Yes. Well, at the beginning, I mean, there's an amazing transformation in his character when he arrives in Egypt. The French had basically been exhausted after 3 years of fighting. They'd been defeated effectively upon landing in Egypt. The British discovered their fleet in Alexandria and sunk. So basically, the campaign is doomed from the start. And after 3 years, the British and the Ottomans basically kicked them out, and the French eventually leave in 1801. The local rulers of Egypt, so Egypt is part of the Ottoman Empire, but it had always been ruled by these Mamluk warlords, so these samurai kind of medieval warriors. They too had been exhausted by 3 years of fighting the French.
Are they, sorry to interrupt you, are those Mamluk warriors, for the lack of imagination, I don't know what other terminology to use, are they sort of native Egyptians, what we would think of as native Egyptians, or are they also sort of from far-flung places?
No, they're not native Egyptians. They are Mamluks technically are slaves. This is what the word Mamluk means.
Yeah.
And they hail back, this is ancient history, 10 centuries before. This is when these Mamluks were sought after by different Muslim dynasties. Basically, they would go and enslave young lands from what is now the Caucasus, places around the Caspian Sea, what is now Georgia and Thracia, eventually many of them ended up in Egypt, and they founded a dynasty. The idea is that these would be young lads out of which you can make an army that would be loyal to you, because they are really freed slaves. So they have no connection to the land. They're also not mercenaries. They're definitely not a standing army. So that's a peculiar way to found an army. In Egypt, they eventually rebelled against the people who had enslaved them and recruited them, and they founded their own army, which is called the Mamluk Sultanate from 1250 to 1517. So that's a very peculiar for a Western ear to hear about slaves founding their own state. When the Ottomans invaded Egypt in 1517, that Mamluk Sultanate disappeared, but the Mamluks themselves continued in Egypt. And they continued to replenish their numbers by buying slaves from the Caucasus, from Central Asia, and descending on Egypt, founding these households. So each household is headed by a prince, a Mamluk emir, and he would have, depending on how wealthy he is, 200, 300 emirs, young boys, and he would train them. And then they would basically live off the land. So they would go and descend on villages, take its produce, but also give back. Cairo is really built by the Mamluks. What we call Islamic Cairo, all of these amazing mosques and hospitals and hospices and schools, they've been built by the Mamluks in the Mamluk Sultanate, but also under the Ottomans in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. So these are the local warriors. These are the Mamluks who, by that time, are really exhausted and very tired, and their resources have been depleted. And that's the situation that Muhammad Ali or Mehmed Ali found in Egypt. Complete chaos. The Ottomans are not in control. The army is very weak. The French had already been evacuated. And the local warriors who had been ruling the country effectively for centuries are also very depleted. And through his cunningness, he saw an opportunity. And he saw, this is a very wealthy country. It's very badly managed. There is a ruler, that is the Ottoman Sultan, who's not ruling. There are local warriors who are very depleted. And I effectively have the only effective fighting force. And through that, from 1801 to 1805, he elbows his way up and establishes one coalition after another, managing to play off one power against the other, until eventually the Ottoman Sultan says, okay, well, I have no alternative except to acknowledge you, complete upstart, someone who'd never set foot in Istanbul, an illiterate, uncouth, upstart man. And he gives him this very, very privileged and prestigious position as governor of Egypt. This happens in the summer of 1805.
At the time, who do you think from his perspective, who do you think his biggest enemy was at the time?
His biggest enemy would effectively be these Mamluks. They are exhausted, but they have their troops. They know the country. to answer your previous question, they're not ethnically Egyptian, but they've been Egyptianized. They know the country well. They're not intermarrying with Egyptians. And again, they keep on replenishing their numbers by fresh slaves being bought from the Caucasus. So they continue to be a formidable power, even though they are much, much weaker than, let's say, 100 years before. The other enemy, well, it's a peculiar relationship, is this, is the Ottoman sovereignty. He knew that Egypt is too important a province to be given to someone like him, someone who's completely unknown. Governorship of Egypt is typically given to someone very high up in the imperial bureaucracy in Egypt, in Istanbul, as a step for further promotion. Ultimately, typically, the governor of Egypt would end up being the Grand Master of the Navy, the Kapitan Pasha, or the Sadrazam, the Prime Minister of the Ottoman Empire, the second most important man after the Tsar. So this is how important the governorship of Egypt typically is. So he knew that it's a matter of time before the Ottomans try to snatch back this important province from him. And the Sultan keeps on sending governors, but to rule Egypt from 1801 to 1805, and they cannot do so because he's really holding on to power, and he has the only militarily significant force.
Were there assassination attempts?
Yes, of course, many. Yeah. Constant. I mean, there are many people being assassinated, and heads literally being chopped off in the middle of a meeting and thrown out of a window. I mean, there are descriptions like this, people going in with their heads above their shoulders and not leaving. And he managed to survive many of these attempts. Maybe he masterminded some of them. We don't really know for sure. So his most important adversary is someone with whom he had a fascinating relationship that can make an amazing, not film, I think a play.
Yeah.
One can write a play of two characters. That is Mehmed Ali and this guy called Husrev, or we call him in Arabic Husrev, who is an Ottoman Pasha, married to one of the freed slaves of the Ottoman Sultan, sent to Egypt to rule it in 1803, finding Muhammad Ali there, and in one of the many interesting twists and turns in the relationship between them when they overlap together in Egypt is a banquet in which Muhammad Ali invites his Husrev, only to find himself put on a ship being sent down the Nile from there to Alexandria, and from Alexandria to Rhodes. He was basically kicked out of the. So this is the of Egypt, and this is the strongest opponent, and this guy continues to be his most formidable enemy for 40 years.
Because he keeps on trying to usurp power.
He keeps on trying to depose Mehmed Ali by being based in the center, in Istanbul. And Mehmed Ali is aware of this, and he knows this guy has a grudge. This guy, Mehmed Husrev, as I've been saying, he's given one important position after the other. He's the governor of Serbia. He's sent to subdue a rebellion against the Kurds. Eventually he's given the Navy, and then the army, and then becomes the Sadrazam. I mean, we can talk about this later. And the paths cross in very, very dramatic ways throughout the teens, 20s, 30s, 40s. It's an amazing relationship between both these men that lasted for more than 40 years.
I want to talk a little bit about, we have to come back to that in a second because it's fascinating, but I want to talk a little bit about the the populace, the actual, the people on the street, what was his relationship like with everyday Egyptians? When did he emerge as a central figure in their imagination? And when did he emerge as somebody who had a strong, approval rating, so to speak?
Oh, I don't think he had a strong approval ratings. I mean, this is not an era where popular opinion, the opinion of the so-called man in the street really mattered.
Mm-hmm.
What mattered is the opinion of the elite. The local elite in Egypt would be big merchants, religious figures in Al-Azhar, the Ashraf, those who claim descent from the Prophet, the Mamluks. These are the people, this is the elite. So what he did with the elite is the following. Let's take the Mamluks. Eventually he decided that a country with two masters is no country, and he decided it's a matter of time. Either they get rid of me or I get rid of them. So he seized an opportunity in 1811. He had been appointed by the Sultan to lead a campaign in Arabia against the Wahhabis who had seized the holy sites, the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. And the Sultan, again, like Egypt itself, doesn't have enough troops to deal with this problem. So he sends some people from Kavala to Egypt. Now he sends people from Egypt to Arabia. So to deal with this serious infringement on the Sultan's sovereignty in Arabia. So Mehmed Ali decides it's a big banquet, big occasion. He has a big banquet to announce officially that his son, his name is Tuskhun, had been officially appointed as head of the campaign. He invites all the dignitaries and he tells them, there's a crier who goes down the streets. He said, Yarin Alai, which means tomorrow there will be a banquet. And he tells Mamluks and the Mamluk leaders to come in their fancy dress, their tuxedos. So they come with their kaftans and their turbans and their feathers and their regalia. And they have coffee with the Pasha. And on the way out, they're trapped in the citadel in a very narrow alleyway. And they're gunned down and massacred to the last man. So in that one day, on the 1st of March, 1811, the military elite in Egypt were literally wiped. All of them. And as I said, these are the emirs. These are the princes who themselves have many, many followers in their households. They have their harems. They have their slaves. So he killed off all this higher echelon and then unleashed his own forces onto the households of these emirs throughout the country, not only Cairo, but throughout, in a campaign lasted for a whole year, chasing them all the way down to Nubia in Sudan.
This is like some mafia type stuff.
This is mafia type, but, multiplied by 50.
A nation. Yeah.
Like this is not one or two mafiosi. This is the entire mafia. Like he literally wiped out a ruling elite that had run the country for centuries. They ceased to exist. All of them. Their lands were confiscated, their palaces were confiscated, their wives and harem were enslaved, and their slaves were enslaved by Mehmed Ali and his son Ibrahim. So this is one enemy. The other contender of power would be the religious figures. And I think you have another slide of the massacre.
I think so too. Yeah.
This is the massacre. This is, of course, back then it was a horrific event, even by the standard of its times. So many European painters were fascinated by it because it's a very dramatic event. And there are many attempts at depicting what it must have looked like. And this is one. I think this is by a painter called Bida, although I'm not sure.
Before we move on to the second enemy, right? Did this just, ripple through the world? I mean, were stories of him told from Morocco to Japan? I mean, everyone must have been talking about this.
Yes, no, it's an infamous event, even by the standards of its time. Again, these are not ruffians. These are not. This is the elite. This is the ruling elite of the country. So the way in which it was done, of course, it was also masterminded because, for them not to get wind of it and to be trapped in this way is a logistical masterpiece, for one emir, if we consider him to be an emir, to manage to kill off all of the others. As you said, it's like it's like The Godfather. It's these scenes that we see in the first part of The Godfather. It's exactly like this, and people in Istanbul, of course, heard about this. And on the one hand, they were happy because they also been trying to get rid of the Mamluks for many years. They actually led a campaign in the 1770s or 1780s for that purpose, and it failed. But on the other hand, now they are even more suspicious of Mehmed Ali, who's now the sole ruler of the country.
Yeah.
With the religious figures, he was more political. He didn't kill them off, but he confiscated their property. He put some of them under house arrest. He exiled some of them out of Cairo. And they effectively ceased to be an important power that be. So I studied him. I studied his career throughout these 40 years. He never went to Al-Azhar. He never had invited any of them to his palace. In fact, we do not see him at all talking to Egyptians. If by Egyptians we mean the dwellers of Egypt, be they, apart from the Mamluks, in the first 5 years, sometimes he would invite them, sometimes they would invite him. Finally, he invited them and killed them off. But with the leaders of the religious figures, typically an Ottoman governor would appear in the following occasions, would appear personally, physically to the people in the following occasion. He would occasionally go on Friday prayers. Eid, Ramadan, the Prophet's Day, these are big festivities, typically would be hosted by the governor. The annual pilgrimage, Al-Hajj, would leave. There are 2 caravans, one from Syria, bringing people from the north, one from Egypt, bringing people from the west, Morocco, all the way, to Egypt. So the big caravan, it's called Al-Mahmal. So this is a big event, again, headed by the governor of Egypt. And typically, this is now something not religious, but something peculiar to Egypt and peculiar to the annual inundation of the Nile, which happens in August. There is a big ceremony in Cairo called Gabr al-Khaliq or Kasr al-Khaliq, whereby a dike was broken to allow the Nile waters to enter through a canal that bisected Cairo from south to north. And this is a big, big occasion. All the religious figures, Muslim, Christian, and Jewish, would attend. Muhammad Ali did none of this. We don't see him in Muld al-Nabi, in the pilgrimage, in the Mahmal, in Kasr al-Khaliq. None of this. He would never attend any of this. Throughout his 40 years, 43 years, he doesn't do this. He has his palace in Shubra, in Cairo, not the palace that he built for himself in Alexandria. There he meets Ottoman dignitaries and European ones. And of course, his officials and members of his elite, who now he's bringing from Kavala, from Anatolia. He got rid of the local elite and is bit by bit building an alternative one. So if you ask me what the locals thought of him, I tell you, the Mamluks, obviously, this is a famous one by David Roberts. This is obviously in Alexandria. So as you can see, these are not the local elites. So European dignitaries, European ambassadors, not ambassadors because consuls, because Egypt is not an independent state. It's a province of the Ottoman Empire. There's a famous line by Gabarti. Gabarti is the famous local Egyptian chronicler who witnessed everything the French did, and then Muhammad Ali. He died in 1821, so the first 15 years of the Pasha's rule, he documents it. And he has a very interesting quotation by some of the peasants. Excuse me, in the Delta, I think, and then they when some tax officials, local tax officials, try and collect taxes as the good old days of the Mamluks, they say to them, no, we are now the Pasha's peasants. So they kind of acknowledge that there is now one Pasha, all the others have been killed off, and he is referred to as El Basha, and they think of themselves as his subjects. I can talk in details about what I think they thought of him, but this is something that developed over the decades. So we can take it one bit at a time.
When did so he's, I mean, in modern terms, he must have been feeling himself, as they say, right? Like he must have been thinking to himself, I'm pretty good at this. I mean, like, for centuries, people have been trying to get rid of these people, these Mamluks. I came in, I figured it out, right?
Yeah.
When did he start setting his sights and allowing his ambitions to expand beyond maybe what the Ottomans wanted him to have?
It's a wonderful question. I try to constantly imagine how the world looked like from his perspective, and how Egypt looked like from his perspective, and what he thought of himself. So there's a tricky, but there is a very intriguing piece of information that I told you. This massacre happened in 1811. He came, he's born in 1770, comes to Egypt in 1801. That means he's 31 years old. He becomes governor officially, age 35. He kills them off aged 40 in 1811. But already, even before he got rid of them, in 1809, he starts building his mausoleum in Egypt. Now, building a mausoleum is really where you, of course, intend to die. I mean, this is where home is. I mean, home is not only where you're born. Home is where you want to be remembered after your death. So the fact that he started building his mausoleum in 1809 is an amazing sign of self-confidence. even before getting rid of the Mamluks, he knew that Egypt is his and that this is where he will die. And I think this, of course, was strengthened when he got rid of the Mamluks. And bit by bit, year after year, decade after decade, he entrenches himself more firmly in Egypt. He brings his family, the 5 kids and the wife. First the kids and the wife, and the 2 daughters. Then his nephews and nieces and uncles and aunts, and then old buddies from Kavala and some Albanians. And they bit by bit come and they have no one. So they're not slaves, obviously. They're in-laws and family, blood relations. But they owe allegiance only to him.
Yeah.
This is a new country. He's the source of their wealth. He's their benefactor. And in Arabic and in Ottoman, it's Wali Ni'am, Veli Ni'met in Turkish. And he is Wali Ni'methum. He is their benefactor. Without him, they wouldn't be in Egypt. So this is the core of his elite. And with them, he starts entrenching himself further. And then he starts attracting Europeans. He had always a bet. He knew that these Europeans are all crooks and they're coming to make money and they're adventurers. The typical Orientalist people who think that this is a backward part of the world. We'll have fun, we'll have sex, we'll have money, it's adventures. We'll probably end up with some antiquities and maybe mummies and, all of the typical Orientalist charm of the East. He knows them. They don't know that he knows this. They think he's just one of those corrupt pashas they can play with. And it's just fascinating when in many of the accounts that they eventually write, these travelers, French, German, English travelers who end up in Egypt, and then they hear about this pasha, so why don't we go and visit him? And then they write about the accounts of the visit. And in these accounts, they themselves acknowledge that something happened to them. They themselves acknowledge that, no, he's the one who's watching us, not we write about him. They write about this. They write about the fact that they have been disarmed by his charisma, by his intelligence, by his power. One of them wrote, Muhammad Ali is a man of a middle stature. He's not particularly handsome, but you immediately recognize the power that he has, just like a scorpion. Very small, but you know that he has poison in his sting. So they write about this and they know about this. But he knew that out of his gamble is out of these 50 adventurers, crooks, maybe there's one hidden gem. It's worth my while investing. I know that they're embezzling. Maybe if I can hit on someone, he can get back. And he did this. So, many Europeans came, engineers, doctors, financiers, technicians of various kinds. A lot of them were good for nothing, but maybe 5 or 6 of them were very, very important. One is Suleiman Pasha, or his name is Colonel Sel, who was a French general or high officer who fought with Napoleon.
Mm-hmm.
He's the one with whom who depended on him to found the modern army.
What year is that?
This is 1821.
And he's renamed as Suleiman Pasha.
Yeah, he converts. He eventually converts to Islam. It wasn't a condition. The Ottomans would not hire would not hire Europeans and give them high-ranking officials because of their religion.
Mm-hmm.
Mehmed Ali didn't mind this. So he didn't force Colonel Serf to convert, in the sense that he didn't make this a condition for his employment, but it just happened. But another French guy, for example, did not convert. His name is Clos, Antoine Barthélemy Clos, is a French physician born in Grenoble and studied in Marseille, or the other way around, born in Marseille and studied in Grenoble and became a physician. He studied with Bichat, was the cutting edge of medical science in France. He comes to Egypt looking for employment. Mehmed Ali gave him a very big task of founding a medical service for his new army. So this guy does not convert, and he's known in Egypt as Klotz Bey. He's given the title of Bey because he did not flee when, unlike all his European colleagues, when cholera hit in 1831, he stayed and protected the army through quarantines, and many others.
Yeah.
So you have his elite, then you have, anyway,
I want to get back to this idea of ambition, right? And setting his sights beyond the sort of what we think of as Egypt. Did he, when did he start? And did he start thinking, I can take over, I can go west, I can go south, I can go north, I can go east. And when did he start thinking, I'll do to the Ottomans what I did to the Mamluks?
No, this is a fascinating question. I mean, the typical way of understanding him is, this is what we learned in school, is that he came and he wanted to expand because Egypt needs its breathing space.
Mm-hmm.
They don't say it in German, thankfully, but they have a German Lebensraum in mind, those historians. So they think of him, Egypt, of course, needs to expand because it needs wood and it needs people and it needs markets. And Muhammad Ali realized this and he starts expanding south and east. I don't think this is how it developed in his mind. I think in his mind, given what I have been describing, he ends up in Egypt in this very peculiar circumstances. He knows that he has many enemies. He gets rid of his local enemies. Then the question is, what will the Ottomans do? He knew the Ottomans are bound to get rid of him or try to get rid of him. And they do, but they fail. So after many years of entrenching himself in further, he starts thinking, no, I need something much more powerful. I need an army to protect myself from any attempts by the Ottomans of dislodging me from the country. So first he starts with his Albanians, and they rebel. They say, no, we have our own way of doing war. We will not put on uniforms. So they rebel, and this is in 1850. So he decides to send them to Arabia, basically to die there in the fight against the Wahhabis. Then in 1818, he decides to enslave Sudanese men. So he sends a campaign under the command of his youngest son. His name is Ismail, with his son-in-law, Muhammad Defterdar, to Sudan, with a mishmash of troops from Morocco and Syria and some Bedouins and the remnants of the Mamluks to enslave as many Sudanese as possible. The campaign fails, it doesn't succeed, and Ismail himself is massacred. So that attempt eventually fails. So 3 years later, in 1821, he takes a fateful decision, which changes the course of Egypt, of Egyptians, and of him, which is to conscript Egyptians. This was a gamble because Egyptians are already suffering under his draconian policies of very heavy taxation, monopolizing everything they grow is now monopolized by his now we can call it state. He now has the semblance of a state, and long forced unpaid labor, corvée, called sukra in Arabic. So to give them arms just when they are really up to here against him was a big gamble. So with Sulaiman Pasha and his son Ibrahim, who proves to be the most successful of his three sons. Ibrahim is born in 1790. So he had him when he was 20 years old. So Ibrahim now is a powerful military man. He has Sulaiman Pasha, ex-Colonel Sev, and fascinatingly, all the slaves of the Mamluks, who when their masters had been massacred, were in their teens, now they are in their 20s. They became the officers of the army, and the peasants are the soldiers. The soldiers, eventually, the peasants rebel against conscription. There's a huge rebellion in Egypt, in Upper Egypt in 1824. It was subdued by that same army. It's a big gamble. Who will win the day? Peasants resisting being transformed into soldiers, or the new soldiers who were only a few months before peasants, who are now being drilled by Sulaiman Pasha and Ibrahim Pasha to be disciplined soldiers with draconian punishments if they don't obey the orders. That's what a modern army is. And the gamble paid off. The new army managed to subdue the rebellion, even when the rebellion happened to be in the same villages from which they had been conscripted. And in one famous incident, one of the young soldiers found his father amongst the rebels, and he shot him.
Wow.
With that, there's a new, a completely new equation in the country. Now Mehmed Ali has got rid of his local rivals, but he also has a reliable fighting force. Now this fighting force is loyal. It is bit by bit being built. It requires many other things. He sees the connections. He sees, they need a medical corps. So he builds Qasr al-Aini Hospital. He hires this guy, Klo, and we have a modern teaching hospital that educates and teaches the new generation of doctors serving for the army.
Yeah.
He realizes that these young soldiers need to be trained. To be trained, we have to have training manuals. Training manuals need to be translated and to be published. So he founds a publishing house. And so on and so forth. Bit by bit, the army becomes the central linchpin of his efforts. So generating the need for many other institutions. The Sultan in Istanbul has his eye on him. He knows what he's been doing. A new rebellion against the Sultan erupts in Greece. Like Egypt before, like Arabia, the Sultan does not have a fighting force capable enough to subdue the rebellion. So he relies now on his powerful vassal, Muhammad Ali, who now has a modern army. And he sends him, Muhammad Ali is reluctant in the beginning. So he goes to Greece in 1824. And in 3 years, he manages to subdue the uprising.
This is 1824. Okay. Got it.
This is 1824. The uprising started in 1822. This is the famous Greek War of Independence.
Yeah.
Started against the Sultan. The Sultan doesn't have troops to subdue it, not enough. So he sends for help. Muhammad Ali is reluctant in the beginning because he sees this is not a small thing. There's a big operation, and this is my new army. Will they be up to the task? He finally has no option because this is an imperial order. He sends the army. The army actually, bit by bit, proves its mettle, and eventually collaborating with the Ottoman army, who's now headed by who? The Navy, sorry. It's headed by Husrev, the guy we forgot a long time ago. He's now the head of the Navy, and Muhammad Ali is coordinating with him to subdue the Greek rebellion. So an answer short, this is not a very short answer, but an answer to your question, how did he go? Well, as I said, bit by bit, trial and error, no blueprint, there's no plan. The main key to understand his policy and his character is that he needs to defend his realm in Egypt. He needs an army. The army prompts him to go to Sudan. That fails. He conscripts Egyptians. Now he has a proper army. The Sultan wants him to subdue the rebellion in Greece, so he goes to Greece. So by the mid-1820s, Mehmed Ali is in Egypt, in the Sudan, in Arabia, and in Greece. And he's the master of Egypt. He has completely overhauled the Egyptian countryside. He has done many things to reform the taxation system. And most importantly, economically, he introduced a new crop in Egypt, which is cotton. I mean, a particular kind of cotton. Cotton has always been produced in Egypt, but this is a long staple cotton that has a market in Lancashire and Manchester for the new industrial revolution in England. So he monopolizes this crop. He forces the peasants in the Delta. So the Delta is transformed into a cotton plantation, and he monopolizes its trade, and it's a bonanza of wealth. And he takes the money of this trade and invests it in the military.
Okay, you just heard the first part of the interview with Khaled Fahmy. We are going to come back in a few days and release the second part. I hope you're enjoying this as much as we are. Thanks so much.